The internet is tired of R34 GTR builds. Not everyone has $250,000. Not everyone can buy a midnight purple Bayside blue gorgeous car with billions of... I'm just kidding. I'm not giving those guys and gals any crap. But when I do say that the GTR is insanely expensive and likely not always the #1 car that you can buy with $250,000, I will say there is a competitive car that carries the same 4-taillight, beautiful RB engine on the front, rear-wheel drive goodness. And that, my friends, is the Nissan R34. Now, you've watched us build this thing for the last 6 to 8 weeks, and it has been a blast. From picking it up from Driver Motorsports, to getting the car in-house, to inspecting what a 37,000-mile R34 can actually look like. And the total price of this one to our door was right around $45,000. Now, the New Zealand folks will scream. The Australians will shout and curse. But for those that have to import the fun cars that we want from Japan, in terms of the price for a yellow EV1 35,000-mile one-owner R34, it's a damn good deal. So you and me are here today so that I can share with you 20 minutes of useless R34 information that we've learned along the way of modifying ours, so that if you're in the market for one, or you just want to know some information for the campfire while you're having a good old drink, this is the video that you can reference. You don't even need to credit me in any of this information. Take it as your own. You're the smart one. You're the beautiful one. Everyone should aspire to be like you. But if you've got a stock car, we need you to modify it over at Martiniworks.com. It would mean the world to us. We can mount and balance wheel and tire packages. We can ship them to your door. We've got Yokohama, Michelin, Pirelli, Ironman if you're a drifter. Plus, we've got work wheels, stage wheels, Conseis, anything that you could ask for. And we're being super fair and honest with how we're labeling this stuff. If we think things might be a little bit more entry level and kind of not always the best value, we're gonna tell you. And if we think it's the best wheel or tire that you can get, we're gonna be really honest with that too. So we're the only ones to do that. We don't really care about trying to become the biggest or best, but we do wanna be the most honest. With that being said, let's talk about this damn car. Why did Nissan make the R34 GT-T? It's the very same reason that Toyota had the Celica. They had the Supra, is an incredible car, is an expensive car. The Celica captured a more obtainable audience that still wanted something fun. It's the same reason that Mazda had with the MX-6. Everybody wanted the RX-7. It was turboed, it was rotary, it had all the sleek looks, but again, that price point was insane. So the MS6 was released. Nissan even had this with the 240SX for the 300ZX. That was another situation. And the GT-T was catered to a group of folks that loved to drive, but didn't have the budget to buy a GTR. Now, we have one of 621, and the EV1 is the 3rd lowest production color you can get in this run. Pretty cool. It's a Series 1. I kind of wish it was a Series 2, but I didn't even know that that existed up until a couple weeks ago. The GTR is a homologation race car, and that is why the GTR is so different than the GT-T. You'll almost always catch this with certain cars. Homologation spec cars that are built on the road feature a ton of different parts. So if you're wondering why a price is so high on a GTR, a lot of the reasons, it's because of that. The same reason that would exist for certain Porsches, certain McLarens, certain Toyotas, things like that. But why would you buy a GT-T? I'm gonna be really honest with you. This was the most affordable way we could get a car that was iconic to me and probably iconic to you at a pretty high price, but still competitive in terms of what we were looking at. I mean, this gives you a ton of fun. You have an RB25 Neo. It's an inline 6. It's turboed. It's rear-wheel drive. It's got a 5-speed manual. It's got, even from factory, it does come with a version of a limited slip differential. I think it's either viscous or helical, but it's still fun, and it still has the recipe that I think made the R34, R33, and R32 iconic, and that is the fact that it's an inline. Now, what's the history of the GT-T? The R34 GT-T, in our opinion, represents one of the last obtainable sports cars from the 90s that still carry the heritage that is Nissan. We've taken this thing out and we've taken it to Dakota's hometown. We've drifted it at US Air. We took it to Road America. We have done so much with this car and it hasn't skipped a beat. Before we were even filming this video, Dakota and I were talking about how we could take this car to California and back and not blink twice. It is insane at how smooth this car is. And in terms of where Nissan was in the late 90s, this is the heyday of Nissan. This is a little bit off topic, but Nissan has had a lot of issues in the past 20 years in terms of figuring out just what the hell they were gonna do with making cars. Nissan, just like the company that absorbed with Datsun, just like Prince before it, was really good at making race cars, but they weren't necessarily great at making normal cars. They would solely rely on the sales of the North American market exclusively to really bring enough love to the brand so that they could make their race cars. Unfortunately, the person that did that went by the name of Carlos Ghosn. He was previously the CEO and executive of the Nissan Motor Corporation, who did a lot to consolidate the Nissan branding, which is why you see a lot of people ask about the Infiniti G35 to the Nissan Skyline nameplate. A lot of people will attribute that decision to deviate the both, especially with the GTR, to Carlos Ghosn, who wanted to consolidate the amount of parts Nissan used, that wanted to consolidate their motorsport involvement, that wanted to make sure that there was really only one real halo car in the Nissan lineup, because otherwise they weren't going to make any money. And before all of that happened, before Carlos Ghosn was really in there making a whole bunch of kind of harsh and cold changes, but the changes that the company needed to make, Nissan was making R34s, and they were making R33s and R32s, and it was a wild time, which is why I think a lot of people love the 90s. Now, how do you buy the right GTT? Super easy. This is a pretty simple one. I would say there's manual and automatic options. If you're looking for one and you want a manual, find a manual. Going with an automatic, it's a 4-speed. It's not bad. You can swap it over to a manual if you really want to, just like you can do with anything. But it is one of those things where if you want something that's going to give you a really nice foundation, it's not going to take that much longer to find yourself a manual option. Now, a 4-door sedan R34 automatic is the ultimate homie hauler, and I will not care if that thing is automatic. Anything on some nice triple chrome, lowered on coilovers, 4-door ER34s, hot. Downright sexy, one might say. I would lick my lips and give that man a kiss. I'm kidding. Talk about rust. Let's talk about rust. R34s, really easy to rust out. Nissan apparently just didn't really quite understand the concept of rust inhibitive, protection. And because the R34 is a little bit of a weird one, the rust can hide. Rust is very common on the strut mounts of R34s. They're very common hiding in between the trunk panel and the rear quarter panel. They're very common for rusting from the inside out, which means a lot of times when you're importing one of these cars, you have to be very careful on who you're using to import the car because they can pull a fast one on you. I know we all want to say that everything in Japan is perfect and bright and everyone loves you and everyone's very respectful, but when it comes down to importing and exporting vehicles, people are brutal and they're trying to make money, which means if they see a little rust on the underside of the car, they may just spray paint that motherfucker black, because if the rest of the car at the bottom is black, just spray a little black on it, you're good to go. A lot of times the inspection reports won't catch it, and even though it's rated a 4 out of 5 on that export paperwork, it's probably actually like a 2. A lot of those cover-ups do happen over time, which is why we went with a low mileage one. We figured there was less risk with a low mileage one that could be rated at a 4 than a high mileage one rated a 4.5 or a 5. Not saying that that would happen, but I'm always gonna go for a low mileage stock version versus a modified high mileage version if you can. Now, 150 to 200,000 is the expected life of an RB25 Neo. Issues with the RB25 are just like any other inline 6, it seems like. They have oil starvation issues. Hammering the engine when you're driving it around, the oil drains in the head aren't big enough, and so what it'll end up doing, it'll starve out the bottom end of the car or of the engine. Don't want that. And because these things are turbocharged monsters, any sort of oil starvation issues get compounded dramatically if you continue to do it over and over and over. These cars get hot, they stay hot. Heat and lack of oil don't mix when you got a bunch of metal moving around. I will say though, if you're wondering what the car feels like, it feels like a more refined and more powerful S chassis. As I drove it on US Air and as Gels drove it on US Air, it became very clear to me that I'm used to driving a very big car to drift, and Gels is very used to the S chassis. He slid that thing like it was nothing because the car was so similar. I think if you wanted to attune it to something like that, you'd be right on the money. The next car you compare the car to would probably be an S15. Which one you would pick, I'd leave that up to you. What are the differences between a GTR and GTT? There's quite a few. RB25 versus RB26, we know that. Single turbo versus twin turbo. Both cars came rated at 276 horsepower, but the GTR completely stock on a dyno would be rated at right around 300 to 320 horsepower because those Japanese manufacturers did a gentleman's agreement so that every car that they reported out was 276, even if it wasn't. That was to stop the horsepower wars. Donut actually did a really cool video on that. It's very, very fun. GTT, rear-wheel drive. GTR is all-wheel drive. GTT, 5-speed or 4-speed auto. GTR is a 6-speed Getrag V160. Very, very good. GTT, you get a multi-link suspension, but with the GTR, you get electronically controlled dampers and adjustable suspension settings through an MFD, which is known as a multifunctional display. You might notice that it looks a little bit like Gran Turismo, and that would be because it was halfway designed by the folks that made that game. Polyphony, I think it is. I probably said that wrong, but just like most of my analogies, I'm really close, but I'm always one word way off. GTT has HICUS. GTR is a better usage of the HICUS because the GTR is all-wheel drive. Most of the time, you're gonna see people delete HICUS. It's a super cool all-wheel steering technology that Nissan had and a bunch of other companies had, particularly in the 90s, but it became unpredictable, especially in higher horsepower settings. And so you'll see a lot of people like ourselves that will take a GK Tech delete kit to it because we don't want to have that random thing happen where it's turning the rear wheels when we're trying to slide or when we're on the track. The GTT is about 400 pounds lighter if you want to brag about something at the campfire because the GTR is all-wheel drive. The GTT and the GTR, I always try to put this comparison because a lot of people think they're very close. They're not. They're very far away. But I wouldn't say they're very far away in terms of way better, way worse. I would almost put them into a different class of car, and then I would shift them just a little bit because the GTR is a monster through and through, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that the GTT is blowing air through straws. It's still a very competent and capable car. Why does the GTT look anemic? We get asked this sometimes. You have to remember that we do have different quarters, bumpers, hood, headlights, wing on a GTT versus a GTR. The back end of the car will always look incredible, but the front of the car always has something weird going on. You're gonna notice that it's because of that badge opening in between the hood and the bumper. GTT has this color painted, like angled plastic piece, whereas the GTR has a fully vented front. Gives it a more aggressive look. Is the RB25 Neo any good? When I saw this engine for the first time, I thought it was the ugliest thing next to, like, honestly, realistically, Nissan Z. I don't know what it is about some of these cars. Some of them look fantastic. The 300ZX, the most gorgeous engine bay of all time. An RB26, gorgeous engine bay. RB25, really ugly. That cover on the top is just gorgeous to look at. It's not, it's terrible. But a lot of people think that because it was a low emissions vehicle, which is something that Nissan did in the late 90s, that it's somehow a less capable engine. In the 90s, Nissan and other exporters from Japan, they weren't necessarily very good at battling the emission side of things in their performance cars. They were very good in the 70s, they were okay in the 80s, and they were bad in the 90s. So, the RB25 Neo, great engine, good engine, still needs some help, but the Neo is what it needed to do to get just enough of change to pass into this low emissions vehicle. You got solid lifters versus hydraulic, you got revised cams, you got a hotter thermostat, and you got a revised intake manifold to increase the air velocity, which actually gave this engine more low-end torque, which is why it feels so much better than the previous generation RB25s on something like an R32. Now the GTR and GTT do share some parts, same rods, no issues with the ringlands, they use the solid lifters, and this one has the N1 oil pump as well, which is good. You're still gonna wanna change over a lot of the oil parts on these cars just because a lot of people will say it's not just about cooling the oil, but you gotta keep the oil moving through the engine, but we'll get into that with another video. If you wanna know some of the parts that we installed on this car, check out Martiniworks Unboxed. That's where we actually unboxed all of these parts. And if you want to hear our in-depth discussion on what the tracks were like when we were out on Road America and when we were at US Air, you can actually go check out the podcast at Martiniworks Podcast. We post every Friday morning. The best way to modify one, let's get into this. This is the best part. Check all your maintenance items. Batteries, injectors, spark plugs, all that stuff typically has to be refreshed when you import a car. Cleaners for your gas, injectors, and all your fluids, all that sort of stuff, 10 out of 10. Cannot speak highly enough. Some of the gas that sit in these cars have sat in these cars for years because they just sit still. Even when you get them over, not every importer's like Driver Motorsports where they're cleaning everything up. Some, they just give you the car and you just got to figure it out. But once you're done with that, here's what we did. Greddy oil cooler. It was $712, way too expensive for what it is, but it's a Greddy and it's an oil cooler. It's a lifesaver. It helps keep the oil cool. It takes about an hour to install and it can help keep those temperatures down. For the wheels and tires, we initially ran with 18 9.5 plus 22 stage nights in the white, which I think looked absolutely killer. We went with a 225/40 R18, which I think was perfect fitment. We also have a set of work Kawamis on the car right now, which I'll show you the specs here on the screen. And then we went with 245/40 R18 Continental Extreme Contact Sport 02s, adjusted the camber, lifted it a little bit, and it makes for a really great track setup as well. For coilovers, we went with Fortunato 510s with helper springs, and we upgraded with Swift springs. This is gonna be about a $2,500 coilover option, but it makes one hell of a difference. The helper springs are needed just because there's not a lot of space on the R34 in terms of what you have for wiggle room in there, and the rear struts for this car are insanely long. And so that's why we wanted to get a little bit of help from Swift, making sure that we had the best spring we could possibly have on it. With the intake, we went with an HKS Super Powerflow intake, mushroom. Dakota really wanted it. Does it make a huge difference in performance? I'm not really sure, but it does sound cool as shit. And it is really rad to look at, and you can finally hear the turbos once you get that put on. So if that matters to you like it matters to us, it's a pretty cheap mod. Now, you do have to be careful with the HKS mushrooms. Remember, that is a plastic, piece that's inside of there. If it starts to deteriorate, you need to get it replaced immediately, especially if you don't have a filter in between that and your intake manifold. HKS high power exhaust we went with. We have not done anything to the middle of the exhaust. That exhaust was $620, and it does make the car sound a million times better. It's not excruciatingly loud because we still have a lot of muffling up into the headers and into the downpipe and all that sort of stuff that we have to deal with. But for now, we're very happy that we could take this to Chick-fil-A and not get judged by the 80-year-olds that are there. This is a 300 horsepower car. It's under $50,000 and it has 37,000 miles. And to us, I think it's a pretty cool car. The question I got asked the most when we were talking about this on our Instagram, which if you want us to pick another car to talk about and you have questions for it, just DM us on Instagram. That's how we pick these series. Why would we buy this car? It's simple. The heritage, the history, it's fun. There's something about driving this car that is insane. And I'm gonna tell you one last story and then I promise we're done. When I had a 1976 280Z when I was 19 years old, I'd drive it around, I'd take it to a quick trip up here in Wisconsin, and when I'd fill it up with gas, the amount of people that came over to talk to me about the car was insane. It wasn't a flashy car, it wasn't a crazy loud car, but something clicked with these folks that at the time were about 40 years old that would come up to me and they'd have to tell me their story. They'd tell me the story on how they had a 240Z back in the day and they raced their friend's IROC Camaro and they won. They would tell me the times where they had a rich friend who sold their 911 to get a Datsun 240Z. They would tell me all the time on how they thought the Datsun was the Jag with the V12 at the time because the car looked so cool. They used to tell me that getting one of these cars was considered getting one of the most gorgeous cars at the time. And that is a memory. It's a core memory that will never go away for these folks because this is a situation that happened 20 years ago. We drive this car to get filled up with gas. We drive this car to a tiny town that Dakota's from, and there are people that will stop, will turn around, that will follow us, that will take us, that will ask us questions at the gas station because that's the car for them. And that's our generation. This is the car that was in the Fast and the Furious. This was the car that was on the posters for a lot of kids that were growing up, not in the era of muscle car magazines, but in the era of Need for Speeds and Gran Turismos. This was the era where people started to realize that Japanese tuner cars were supercar killers. This was the heyday of Japanese dominance in the sports car industry. And when we were kids, there's a part of us that never escapes that. And there's a truly special experience about driving a car that has that. Cars like the Starion, cars like even the Mitsubishi Evo, the Subaru GC8, and of course, I have to give credit where credit is due. The car that truly sits at the top from that era is the R34. And even though this may not be a GTR, it's still damn close and people love it. I'm Alex Martini. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want us to talk about another car, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget, if you're looking for car parts, mod your car, Martiniworks.com.